I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Every Wednesday, photographers meet here to connect, inspire, and create. Our guest speakers share their images, a little bit of inspiration, and their favorite tips and techniques to help you improve your photography. The schedule for our upcoming presentations is on my website at lindanickell.com, as well as the links to previous sessions on YouTube. Tonight's guest is nature and wildlife photographer Harvey Payne. Harvey's images have appeared in respected newspaper and magazine publications that include National Geographic, New York Times, USA Today, Southern Living, Travel and Leisure, and the Nature Conservancy. And that's just a few of them. Most notably, Harvey has over 100 images as part of a permanent prairie exhibit at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. In tonight's presentation, tips and techniques for making pleasing wildlife photos. Harvey will talk about composition, light, and the equipment you'll need for wildlife photography. As a bonus, he's going to also share some of his favorite wildlife locations. You can connect with Harvey through his website at harveypaynephotography.com. So with that, I want to welcome you to the Happiness Hour, Harvey.
Thank you, Linda. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to meet everyone that's in attendance. One thing I've learned is, photographers are a very open group of people. And, I tell people, if you want to feel incompetent and inadequate, take up photography. But I've had the privilege through the years of hanging out with some very fine photographers and some that wanted to be. And you can learn a lot. And I haven't found any of the top-notch photographers that were not willing to share their knowledge, their tips, to help you along, and I appreciated that. And I want to commend you for hosting this forum, and I want to thank you for asking me. You probably never thought I would do it, and I never thought I'd hear from you again after that cold, frosty morning in Bosque del Apache, but you never know. I just returned from Yellowstone, and, you never know who the fellow next door is. Met a guy from California that does the most amazing nighttime photography. In fact, he teaches night photography. And then a fellow from Utah that does some totally unique landscape work, just different than anything I've seen before. But it's a pleasure to hang around people like that, and it's a pleasure to hang around people that join your forum tonight. I want to begin with an Ansel Adams quote. Sure, most of you know who that guy was. He said that great photographs do not just happen. They are produced by thoughtful, experienced photographers. And that is so true. It takes a very rare person to be able to jump into photography and start producing really good results immediately. It's a learning process. And fortunately, it's one that never ends. If you feel like you've learned everything to know in photography, you're way behind the curve. So it's an exciting thing. For me, wildlife and nature, I've always lived in a rural area, except for during my formal education, and always had a lot of wildlife and nature around me, and felt blessed to get to experience that. And so that's what led me into photography, is the desire to capture some of the beauty I was seeing and share it with other people. And that's been rewarding for me. I want to start by saying, what I'm going to tell you tonight are my ideas based on my experiences. Pardon the personal reference, but I don't know how to talk about somebody else's experiences. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I don't even think I know all the questions. And so we can learn from everyone. Hopefully, you'll learn from some of my mistakes and some of the things that I feel like I've done right. One friend, that very fine photographer, told me something I've never forgotten. That is, a good photographer is never satisfied. And that is so true. You look at your images, especially look at some you took a few years ago that you thought were just perfect at the time. Now they might be deleters, and you can always see something that you would like to have done differently. And that's what keeps you going back to the same spot over and over to capture a better photo than what you got before. The other thing I tell people with wildlife is expect the unexpected. I've been around wildlife my whole life, and I have some friends that are consulting wildlife ecologists. And, I've experienced things in the woods that they've never seen. And if the only way you can anticipate the action, which is what you need to do with wildlife, is through experience. But you have to realize that we just catch a small glimpse of the animal or bird's life. And if we think we know all about that animal or bird, we're going to be sadly mistaken, because they'll prove you wrong regularly. One other photography friend told me, and this fellow, I don't want to be a name dropper, but at one time he was the most published wildlife photographer in North America. And I met him in Alaska. And he said, effort expended equals results achieved. Another photographer friend I met in Alaska had a friend that wanted him to look at his portfolio and critique his portfolio. And he looked at it and he said, "It looks like your wife was waiting in the car," which I'm not trying to be a sexist, but it's another way of saying you didn't invest the time you needed to invest to really get top-notch results. Needless to say, when you're photographing wildlife, show them at their best. You want to make them appear as good as you can. I spend a lot of time with bison. Here in Oklahoma, we have the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, and my wife and I actually raise bison as well. Invariably, when you're in a herd of bison, some of them are going to be doing things that you don't want in your photograph. So you obviously just don't put those in. The other thing about wildlife is try to shoot up at it. Shoot on the same level or try to shoot up. You don't want to shoot with a camera angle pointed down. That tends to minimize the impact of that animal and makes it look diminutive. And then, as I said, you have to experience or have to anticipate the action, and you have to be thinking all the time, what's going to happen next, and how do I adjust my camera, my lens, whatever, for that situation. And then be patient. Let the action come to you. And of course, it goes without saying that you have to be ethical. You can't push wildlife. You can't push birds. You don't want to do things. They live in a world where they are on somebody's menu 24/7. And you don't want to do anything to put them in a position that would jeopardize their health, safety, or even life. For example, if you find a bird nest and you want to trim a few limbs so you'll get a better shot of the bird on the nest or the chicks in the nest or whatever, don't do that. That nest was built that way for a reason. And if you do that, you run the risk of causing them to die. And then in photos, to have a successful photo, so often it needs to tell a story. And that is really hard to accomplish with a two-dimensional object such as a photograph. It's really hard to tell a story. If you can produce a photo that tells a story and tells something about that bird or animal, then that's a successful photograph. The other thing to remember is with wildlife and nature and birds, you still use the same compositional guidelines. I don't say rules because you have to bend them and break them all the time, but you still use the same compositional guidelines. Look for color contrasts, look for lighting contrasts, look for diagonal lines. Of course, the rule of thirds comes into play frequently. And then if you can produce a photograph that strikes an emotional chord, then that's a successful photograph. That's really hard to do. You have to look for it. There are a number of ways to do that. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And then finally about photography, remember the KISS method. If you've taken a photography class, and I taught photography for about 10 years, keep it simple, stupid. It's hard to produce a simple photograph, but those are going to be the successful ones. The photos that are too busy or too much going on in the background usually don't work out so well. I want to talk a little bit about equipment. And I know when you start talking about cameras and lenses, it's like politics and religion. People have very strong feelings one way or the other. And the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, is regardless of what the camera manufacturers would have you believe, there's no Excalibur camera. There's no magic camera that's automatically going to deliver perfect photos every time. You've got to remember a camera is just a tool. And it's kind of like a car. It all gets back to the loose nut behind the wheel. It's the person operating the camera. Some cameras have better tools than others for wildlife. And a lot of times you have to figure that out for yourself. The other thing you're going to need with wildlife is a sturdy tripod. I shoot from a blind a lot. I have a number of blinds. The one I use the most is one I made out of exterior plywood because it can be left out in the weather all the time. It doesn't flap in the wind, and you can leave it there and the animals and birds get used to it. It's not a new object that causes them to be alarmed. And then often I shoot out of a vehicle. A vehicle is a great blind. So often wildlife is accustomed to seeing vehicles. And if you're in the vehicle, they're often not going to be alarmed. In that vehicle, what I often use is a window mount. And if you can see this one, I don't know if it shows up. This is one from Kirk Enterprises. And I've had one since the late 80s, and it still works very well. The one I held up is my wife. She wanted one, and so we got her one. But it's very sturdy, very good for wildlife photography. And then to improve your photographs, photography is like playing golf, tennis, or whatever. The more you practice, the better you're going to be. And critically review your results. You don't learn much when people say, "Oh, that's a wonderful photograph." You want to see what they really think about that. And then develop your own style. What I do is what works for me or what I think works for me. That doesn't work for everybody. And develop your own style, follow your own interests. So anyway, let's jump into a few examples. Are you ready?
Okay, everybody cross your fingers. All right. Can you guys see that okay? Harvey, can you see it?
It's the optical quality is not great, but let's go to the next one, see what it looks like.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, that's better. Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
One example of anticipating the action, like I say, I photograph bison a lot. You will often see throughout the entire course of the year, the younger animals playing like these two are actually fighting. They will put their heads together, but they're just playing. They're not really serious. It doesn't take an expert to see that these two guys meant business. This was during the breeding season, during the rut at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. This would have been in late July. It's usually pretty hot. And, so often you see posturing, you see bellowing, you see pawing the ground. But every now and then, if you find two bulls of the same size, they really hit hard. And it is an awesome sound. In this instance, it happened so quickly. I had a 200 to 400 millimeter lens on, and I had to go with that. It's a little tight. But the other thing is, they get their heads so low to the ground. If it had been taller grass, you could have only seen part of their heads, usually the top. So you can tell with the bull on the right, his hind feet are off the ground. They meant business. Even the flies are coming off of the bison. They hit so hard. So again, this is to illustrate, capture the peak of the action and try to show a feeling in your photograph. And this is another example of telling a story. This was in Denali National Park in Alaska, shot from a vehicle. And we watched the sow grizzly, which is in the center of the photograph, with 2 yearling cubs, and they were feeding and unaware that a male was coming up the valley towards them. And what the males will try to do is to kill the cubs so the female will come back into estrus and he can breed her again. So what this male did when he realized the sow and 2 cubs were there, he started closing in. Originally, the cubs were on the other side of the female. She put them behind her, and she's standing broadside to that male to look as big and tough and imposing as she can. She's considerably smaller than he is, but she backed him down. The cubs didn't know what to think. They were just onlookers. But it was pretty tense there for a while because the male could have killed the female and he could have killed the cubs. So hopefully this tells a story. An example of finding dramatic light, you know, the prairie is a very difficult subject for most people, including me, to photograph. You have to have the sky working for you. If you don't, the photos are usually a little underwhelming. And so whenever I find a thunderstorm coming, I try to hook it up to the tallgrass prairie preserve. And in this instance, we had bison on a hilltop, which is sometimes not the case, and then dramatic lighting. And then again, striking an emotional chord. These 2 cedar waxwings were in Minnesota. And, you know, the background is a little distracting, but I don't think it's a problem. But what that is a courtship maneuver between a male and a female. You've got the limb that's a bit of a diagonal line, which is pleasing. But more than anything, your eye's attracted to the male feeding the female the berry. And it's part of the bonding process that they go through. This was with a 600 millimeter lens with a 1.4 extender. And it just so happened the light was soft. You often don't want bright sunlight. You want diffused light. And I thought the light worked pretty well. The telephoto lens pretty well took care of the background. Another way to show mood in a photograph is with a reflection. And in this instance, I was in a vehicle blind, and I was trying to photograph another bird, trying to work a kingfisher. Whenever you're locked in on something, try to remember to look around, look behind you, look to the side, look whatever. And I just happened to notice this northern flicker coming in to get a drink. And it turned out the light was pretty nice for what I wanted. And the day was totally calm, so the water was calm, and you get a nice reflection, which helps add mood to the photograph. And then another way to show or to capture mood is to show interaction between or among species. And this was during the bison rut. And bison, they don't always show the most emotion. And, you know, anybody can tell from looking at this that there's some romance in the air. The female is indicating her acceptance of the male. And to me, it captures or strikes an emotional chord. This was in Yellowstone several years ago. We were photographing trumpeter swans at Swan Lake. And just 30 minutes before this photograph was made, a little thunderstorm came through, and it was sprinkling and blowing. And so we found these 2 trumpeters with 2 young, and they were where we could get close. And the sky turned nice. It wasn't clear. It was bright overcast, which is the kind of light you wanted. And the air was totally calm. So the surface of the lake became a mirror. And this trumpeter swan started preening itself and gave me a nice reflection. And I liked the feather floating in the water. And you can probably count on one hand the times you've seen the bottom of a trumpeter swan's foot. But anyway, you've got to be watching for these things. I had to have the camera elevated as high as I could to crop out anything I didn't want, and then used a pretty small aperture to try to get as much depth of field as I could. This is at Bosque del Apache. We go there about every year. The lake was frozen over. There was a dead snow goose, and these northern harriers were fighting over it. We were in a Jeep, and a lot of trees were growing along the bank, and I could find this one little narrow passage to shoot through. And I didn't have a window mount with me, so I rested the lens on a mirror and then rolled the window where it put the camera where I wanted it. This was with a 600 f4 with a 1.4 extender. And so I had to pre-focus. And when I saw the other Harrier coming in, I started firing. And especially with a mirrorless camera, this was not a mirrorless camera, but you have a little lag time with most mirrorless cameras. So you better start shooting just a little bit ahead of the peak of the action. But this, I think, shows quite a bit of emotion between the two northern Harriers. Next. This was also in Yellowstone. It gets back to expect the unexpected. This was in late October. It was snowing lightly, and up ahead on the road, we saw this grizzly. And this was the famous Scarface grizzly that was poached about 2 weeks after that, just outside the park in 2015. You can see his right ear was mangled. But what I did is my wife was driving the pickup, and so I opened the door and kneeled on the ground and shot, and then got back in when the bear got reasonably close. This was with a telephoto, obviously. You don't want to become a statistic with a grizzly bear. But to me, I like the snow on the bear. I like the snow in the background. I like the posture and the bear coming at me. And then this was a very cold morning. It was 0 degrees on the prairie. And the bison will often, in situations like that, get frost in their hair. So, it points up the need to be out there. It's not always 70 degrees and sunny with a light breeze. Photography can be pretty brutal at times. In this instance, for it to get that cold, it has to be a clear night. And it was. And you can see just a few rays of sunlight hitting the bison. If you wait any longer, the shadows and the light areas get very harsh and very contrasty, and the photo does not work. So what I did is I was kneeling and shooting up at the bison, and then wanted to show the pleasant look on the bison's face with the frost in the hair. Another Bosque del Apache shot. Several ways to show mood. Reflections do, silhouettes do, and nice, pleasant late afternoon light do. And then showing interaction between or among species. And in this instance, these two sandhill grains are greeting each other. And then hopefully this tells a story. This was a controlled burn at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. What you can't see is to the right of the image were more flames. There was actually a film crew with Cornell Lab filming this. And you don't often see animals fleeing the fire, but in this case, these two white-tailed deer were fleeing the fire. And you can tell that there's some consternation with the deer. I mean, they were wanting to get out of harm's way. This is obviously a bald eagle on the nest. We live along Bird Creek, and Bird Creek was named Bird Creek for a very good reason. This eagle nest is actually on our property and has been an active nest for 20 years or so. Fortunately, it's in a very large sycamore tree on the north side of the creek, which the bank on that side is fairly low. On the south side of the creek, the bank is pretty high. So when I saw the eagles were using the nest well in advance of this shot being made, I put up a blind and got in the blind. And I would get in the blind at the first light of the day. On 2 different days, I stayed in the blind for 9.5 hours. If you want to become a philosopher, get in a photo blind for 9.5 hours. I promise you, you'll be talking to yourself. But in this instance, the eagle is bringing food to the chicks. You can't see the chicks. They're still pretty small and down in the bottom of this nest. These nests are huge. What I had to do in this instance, you can see there are quite a few limbs in the way. And there's nothing you can do about that. You just have to live with it. So what I did is I had the camera set up on a tripod. This is a pretty large telephoto. Had a remote switch in my hand, and I had pre-focused. I'd already adjusted the exposure. You can't let the camera focus itself. It's going to focus on one of those mini branches, and you're going to miss the shot. So I had to focus where I thought the eagle was going to be. This can take hours or days. And so I saw the eagle coming, and before the eagle approached the nest, I started on the shutter release. You know, it used to be called a shutter release. Now it's called a remote switch or whatever. But you start with the motor drive going and then try to capture the eagle coming in. And for me, it worked out in this instance. Another example of looking for lighting contrasts, backlighting with wildlife is often your friend. You can see the diagonal lines of the hillside and the lighting contrast and the color contrast. And this was bison walking down this slope at the first light of the day. Another example of mood and lighting contrast, this elk was crossing the Madison River in Yellowstone. We had been watching and photographing elk before that, and I was using a different lens. This was with a 600 with a 1.4 extender, and I had it in the Jeep, and I had the other lens in my hand. When I saw the elk heading for the stream, I hurried to the Jeep, set up the tripod, set up the lens, and got him as he crossed the water and just came up the other side. Look for dramatic lighting like that. Look for the lighting contrast and look for the color contrast. Not to mention, that's a very impressive elk in his own right. Working on a book project, and I felt like I needed a kingfisher image. And if you've ever tried to photograph kingfishers, good luck. For me, they're very challenging. Found this one using a small pond, and I set up a blind, and I waited and I waited and I waited for days and days and days. And about the time I would get out of the blind, the kingfisher would fly off and I didn't even know he was around. So what I did is I found a limb that would make a good perch. And I put on rubber boots, drove a steel T-post into the pond, wired this limb in an appropriate place, and hoped the kingfisher would come. And finally, after days and days of trying, he finally showed up and was able to get an exposure of him that I thought was pleasing. Another bosquet photo, the diagonal lines with the wings. You've got the sandhill crane moving into the action, and the lighting in this case, if you catch them just right, their eyes will come on fire. And in this case, the sunlight was just right to illuminate his eye and illuminate the contours of his body. Of course, you have to use a pretty fast shutter speed to stop the wing beat, and you have to be prepared to endure some cold weather. And people wanting to talk to you about photography while you're trying to take photos, especially named Linda. Just teasing.
He's kidding. He's kidding. I behave myself.
This is another tallgrass prairie scene, and hopefully it shows emotion with the two calves nuzzling each other in the foreground, and then the two calves frolicking in the background. So often wildlife images are landscape photos with wildlife put in them. And you can see this follows the general rule of thirds. The horizon line, this was the sky doesn't do anything for the photo. You need to show the horizon, but you don't want to show much of the sky. You just want to show enough to show what it is. But the viewer's attention will be attracted to the bison calves. Another example of scouting, I spend a lot more time planning and searching for photos than I do actually taking them. And so this was a very scenic spot. Of course, you had to get there at first light of the day. Another example of a silhouette, and backlit, which I think adds mood to the photograph, not to mention that it's a very nice large bull moose. This was in the Tetons. And then getting in close, that can often add to a photograph. In this case, this was at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. We had a little shower that morning, which caused the hair to show a lot more curls and a lot more texture than it would otherwise. And then to me, there's something that's just enchanting about a bison's eye. And so I wanted to move in close enough to show the eye, to show a bit of the horn and a bit of the rest of the head, but mostly show the shape and contour of the hair. And then another example of striking an emotional chord. This cow is protecting her newborn calf, and you can tell that you don't want to mess with her. They're very protective animals. Again, giving them a base, kind of following the compositional rules. And then with nice soft lighting. With bison and harsh sunlight, it's really hard to make it work. It's not that you can't, because you can, but this is perfect lighting for bison because it shows so much more of the animal. They're very dark animals. Those dark hairs absorb a lot of light, and you can get too much contrast in a hurry. Another, capturing the peak of the action. This was in the Tetons, and this bull, I'd first seen a cow and a calf on the other side of this is the Grevant River. And then this bull showed up, and he had to go through a lot of guy things. He was pawing the ground. He was urinating in a wallow. He was wallowing. He was thrashing trees. And then all of a sudden he decided the chase was on, and he started chasing this cow. And when she saw what he was up to, she and the calf took off, and then he took off following them. To me, the water splashing adds a pleasing element to the photograph. You can see in his eye, he means business. I was just hoping he followed her and didn't come my way. And then another example of capturing the peak of the action. This is a Mississippi kite, and this was in our backyard. So often people think you have to go to exotic places like the Tetons or Yellowstone or Bosque del Apache or wherever to photograph wildlife. Your backyard can be pretty nice too. And if you only do wildlife photography when you're traveling, your photography is not going to grow very much. But we saw 24 of these Mississippi kites feeding ravenously, and they're just like fighter jets. They go so fast, but I was able to handhold a 600 millimeter lens and capture the Mississippi kite closing in on this insect. You cannot see that with your unaided eye, but you will see things in your photographs that your eye could not pick up. I could not see that insect, and they catch them on the wing, they eat them on the wing, and they are very fast flyers. So you can learn a lot about animal behavior or bird behavior through your photography. And a Costas hummingbird in Saguaro National Park in Arizona, showing them in their natural habitat. Again, nice light, moved in close enough, and capturing the peak of the action. You pretty well have to pre-focus. These hummingbirds, they dart around really fast. But by pre-focusing, pre-composing, and then when the time happens, you trip the shutter. And then, again, the background is not a problem. Backgrounds don't take care of themselves. You have to be planning for the background, and you don't want a busy background. An example of planning, bobcats are really hard to photograph in this part of the world. They're nocturnal. are mostly nocturnal and very secretive, very quiet, very shy. This one was on our place, and we had seen him before, and using a cabin as a blind, and just opened the window and put a camouflage screen over it, and put out some food for him and rewarded with that. On one morning, I got to spend 4.5 hours continuously with this bobcat at 14 yards. I felt like I had a college class in bobcat behavior. I felt very blessed to experience that. Next. Coyotes in this part of the world are shot at 24/7, and they're considered something that most people want to eliminate. My wife and I don't feel that way. We love coyotes and love listening to them and trying to photograph them, but they're the hardest animal in the world here for me to photograph. They're very sharp, they're very wary, their senses are amazing, and if they see anything out of place, they're gone. In this instance, this was shot along the side of a pond, and you can see how tall the grass is behind the coyote. Luckily, on the edge of the pond, the grass was short. And so I put up the wooden blind that I talked about earlier and left it there for a long time for everything to get used to it. Then I would drive to the blind, unload my gear, and drive the pickup about 1/2 mile away and hide it so that any coyote coming in would not see the pickup. They would not see anything out of place. And then I put up a speaker for a predator call, and I had to have a north wind because I was shooting to the north. The coyotes will smell you in a minute if the wind is blowing to them. So I had to have the breeze blowing from them to me. And then I wanted to catch the early morning light. So I had a very narrow window in which I could shoot. And so once the conditions got right, I would turn on the predator call and hope for the best. Most of the time you strike out, but every now and then you get lucky. This coyote came in, you can see the eyes, it's a very sharp photograph. He heard the shutter release and left. That's how wary they are. Another example of using a blind and capturing the peak of the action. This is a greater yellowlegs feeding on small invertebrates in a small wetland migrating through, heading north in the springtime, and an example of scouting and preparing and getting the blind set up. You cannot see this behavior either with your unaided eye. You can see them feeding, but you can't see that they're catching anything. So what you have to do is just give a big burst of images and hope for the best. And then, like I mentioned, the prairie is really hard to photograph. You need the sky working for you, and atmospheric conditions like a thunderstorm with lightning, to me, are pleasing elements to put in a photograph. Also very risky. I shot this out of a pickup. I didn't want to be out on the ground with a window mount and a lightning trigger. And every now and then you get lucky. And finally, didn't think we'd ever get here, an example of moving in close and being prepared. This bighorn ram was in the middle of the road in the east entrance of Yellowstone National Park. And you can see nice light for that. There's something enchanting to me about the eye of a bighorn ram. But an example of moving in close, having enough depth of field to show the body parts, but not so much that the background's a problem. And that's the last image.
So let me see if there are any questions in here. And if anybody has one, this is a great time to put those in here. All right. A lot of these are just nice comments. Great action of the Harriers. I love the romancing bison. That's what Sue has to say. What I loved, and I did get a preview of all these photos, was the curly hair on that bison, that close-up. That was just wonderful. All right. Let me see here real quick. I'm not seeing any questions in here for you, Harvey. Okay, here we go. Susan Hanson wants to know, what is a lightning trigger?
Okay, a lightning trigger is a device that fits on the hot shoe of a camera, plugs into where you would put your remote switch, and it senses a lightning pulse. Usually lightning strikes are not just one strike. If it's just one quick strike, you're not going to get it. But usually it's the lightning bolt will pulse. And so that's what you capture with the lightning trigger. The lightning trigger will cause the shutter to activate and make an exposure. You cannot do it without a lightning trigger. The only other way to do it is to use a very small aperture, a very slow ISO or film speed, and leave the lens open for a few seconds at a time, and then do it again and hope the lightning is in your image. But a lightning trigger, pardon me, a lightning trigger greatly simplifies the process.
Okay. Do you have a favorite? Do you have a brand that you are using that you would recommend?
I don't even know what brand I have.
Okay, that's okay. That's all right. I know that there are a couple of different ones out there. And
there are different ones, yes.
Yeah. All right. I did see a question again. I think this is also from Susan. When you pre-focus, what do you focus on?
Well, that's a lot of Kentucky windage. You have to focus where you think the bird, like in the case of the eagle, is going to be. Sometimes you have to make corrections from one image to another. But what I would do in that instance is try to focus on a limb that I thought was going to be in the same focal plane as the eagle and focus on that. And then once you make images, review your images and see if your focusing needs adjusting. But what these things will do, you think you're going to learn how an eagle is going to bring food into the nest. The next time they do it completely differently. So it's a little bit of a hit and miss.
Okay. David made a comment here. It's kind of a question as well. In the trumpeter swan image, he says he didn't see a horizon line. Was the photo shot with only the water in the background?
Yes, there was not a horizon line. I elevated the lens as high as I could. This is a pretty good sized lake to begin with, but there is no horizon line.
Okay. Susan's got a question in here, and it ties me into something that I had said that you would share with us as maybe some of your favorite places. Susan's question is first, is there an area that you have not photographed on your wish list? What are your next travel trips?
Oh my gosh, that's endless. We like North America. There are a lot of exotic places in the world, but there are a lot of wonderful places here. I haven't spent much time in California. Some lovely places to go there. The East Coast is famous for the colors. You were talking about the trees in Michigan earlier. The New England colors are legendary. I do a lot of photography besides birds and animals. I do a lot of nature photography as well. But yeah, a lot of places. One other thing I was going to suggest on where to go is preserves. And, the Nature Conservancy is active in every state and 70 foreign countries. And they have some really nice preserves in every state. And often they're looking for photographs. And I know of a number of photographers that photograph at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve and then donate their photos to the Nature Conservancy. So look at nature preserves. National parks are great if you like being around a lot of people. If you want to get away from the people, you've got to hike, and you don't have to walk very far to get away from the crowds. But if you're someplace where people can drive their vehicle, you're going to have a lot of friends when you're trying to do your photography. And then, like I said, your backyard. I started to tell you, one year I sold 2 images to Audubon Society for their calendars. One was the wild bird calendar. They only use 14 images for the whole calendar. The one they bought was in my backyard. And then the engagement calendar photo was a half a mile from my house. So don't think you have to go someplace exotic. I mean, it doesn't have to be Yellowstone Falls in every image. Look close. Look at nature preserves, look at city parks, look at state parks, a lot of great places to go that get overlooked.
Harvey, did they come to you? How did they find your image, or is that something you submitted?
For Audubon, yeah, I
Mhm.
submitted them.
Okay. Okay.
And what they used was a northern cardinal of all things.
Of all
One fellow
things.
said they must have had 400,000 northern cardinal images. So, a lot of that's just blind, staggering luck.
Yeah. That counts as far as I'm concerned. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions in here. So, did you ever think that you would be here in my little Zoom box?
You never know.
You
I
never know.
always tell people, like the baseball player, and it wasn't Yogi Berra, it was Joaquin Andahar. When the reporter asked him what kind of a year he was going to have, he said, "You can sum it up in one word: you never know." And that applies to photography too. But it's been a pleasure meeting you. It's been a pleasure working with you, and it's been a pleasure interacting with your guests.
I really appreciate you coming to do this because really, I think our conversation was maybe 20, 25 minutes before we were standing at the flight deck at Bosque del Apache. And it was so cold. I have nerve damage in my fingers and my toes, and I could not feel my toes at that point. And I remember my face being really, really frozen. And here you were standing just as comfortable as you could be. And I'm looking around going, if I don't talk to somebody, my face is going to freeze. And that's kind of why I turned and chatted with you. So just that small exchange, I learned a little bit about you. And one of the things we didn't talk about, and I didn't mention, is I'd never heard of the tall grass prairie. And you have been photographing it. You've written books. You've recently published another book. And I forgot to mention that. Would you like to share that?
Well, I was solicited to do a book, and I partnered with one of the country's leading experts on Lewis and Clark, a retired Western history professor named James P. Ronda. That's the most dynamic speaker I've ever heard. And I met him in 1990, and it was my goal. And this was his 11th book. His most famous book is Lewis and Clark Among the Indians, which is the Indian perspective of the Lewis and Clark voyage. And so anyway, he agreed to do the writing. I did the photography, and it's called Visions of the Tall Grass. It was published by the University of Oklahoma Press.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. So a couple of questions have kind of sneaked back in. So let me see if I can get you to answer them quickly. Donna's curious, do you typically use a prime lens or a zoom?
Well, I use both. And my favorite wildlife lens, I shoot Canon. And, I don't want to step on anybody's toes. I think any of the major brands are very comparable. But Canon has a 200 to 400 millimeter lens with a built-in 1.4 extender that is extremely sharp, and it's a fixed f4, and unless you engage the teleconverter, then it becomes a 5.6. It's very sharp. It's very versatile for wildlife. You can't tell the difference in that and a prime lens. I also use a 600 millimeter f4 frequently, and that is a prime lens, and it's a pleasure to use. It's also a little bulky, but I use both. Those are the two lenses I use more than any other.
Okay. And that's what I meant. That's probably what drew me to you, is that big 600. All right. There's one other question in here, and Anne, it's a great one. She's curious, do you have any tips to get started selling your images?
You have to find a niche. And what worked for me was the tall grass prairie. I'd been photographing it way before an effort began here in 1984 to establish a tall grass prairie preserve. So I already had a very large portfolio of photographs. There are so many photographers and so many photographs. If you start sending your work to publishers, asking them if they're interested, you're probably not going to get a response. But if you have a niche that you can fill that's generally not filled, and they're coming to you asking for photographs, you've got a sale. So find your niche, expand your niche, and work with nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy. You'd be amazed how many referrals you will get if they, you let them use one of your photographs for free. Well, somebody will contact you and say, "Hey, I'd like to buy that, or I'd like to use that in this magazine, or whatever." So you never know, but you've got to find a niche. And I promise you that niche is not someplace like Yellowstone. You're not going to sell an image of Yellowstone Falls. But if you can find something that is not covered by everyone, and you get good quality images, you will find a market for them.
Harvey, that is great advice. And I cannot thank you enough for coming and sharing what you know and not blocking me from your email. More importantly, that. So, guys, you can connect with Harvey through his website, harveypaynephotography.com. Next week, Valerie Hoffman returns to talk about planning for your next photography adventure. And she's got some experience to back that up. She just returned from Norway, so hopefully she'll share some of her images from that trip. Until next time, go out and create something beautiful, and I hope that we see you again soon.